Okay. Good. Just afternoon, everyone. Well, just been past 12, so it's good afternoon rather than good morning. We are now going to turn our hand towards a whole new section of Torah. The third book, the book of Vayikra, Leviticus. And if you thought we were done with the Mishkan and sacrifices and all of that, guess again. We're just getting started. So we had the wonderful long chapters over the last half of, more like a third of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, that dealt with the building of the Mishkan and its inauguration, its construction. But you built a lovely building. How do you use it? What goes on in it? What's the procedure? That's what we're going to see in our discussion now for Vayikra. So is everyone excited?
Yes.
Yes. Good. So we're going to go ahead and start on page 590. We're going to begin with the second chapter of the book of Vayikra. And remember, don't think you're getting off lucky that you don't have to read the rest of it because it's right on chapter 2. Personal Torah reading every week involves the entire parasha. Whatever you may read in synagogue, whatever you may read when you're studying together, every individual has the requirement to read the full parasha every week on their own time. Good. As long as we got that repeated. Volunteer. Come on, it's easier than doing a sacrifice. You never read. All right, Michael.
When a person presents an offering of grain to the Lord, his offering shall be of choice flour. He shall pour oil upon it, lay frankincense on it, and present it to our sons, the priests. The priest shall scoop out of it a handful of its choice flour and oil, as well as all of its frankincense. And this token portion he shall turn into smoke on the altar as a gift of pleasing odor to the Lord. And the remainder of the grain offering shall be for our own and his sons, the most holy portion for the Lord's gifts. All
right, pause there. So we are talking here about a grain offering, what's referred to as a mincha offering. And how does this work? You take some grain, take the flour, right? What's happening? You bring it to Aaron and the priest, a little oil, a little frankincense, and then you throw the whole thing on the fire. No, you don't throw the whole thing on the fire. What's that? Right, you take a little scoop, that gets thrown onto the coals of the altar and turns it into what's referred to as a pleasing smoke. Isn't that what they call it here? Right? What's the translation they use?
Odor.
A pleasing odor, right. The reach nichoach, the pleasing odor. Yeah, that's where reach comes from.
That's Yiddish. Oh, that's where you get it from.
We didn't actually get it from the Yiddish. I hate to tell you. Hebrew predates Yiddish.
We'll talk about that later.
Turns that portion into a pleasing odor, and the rest of it into the trash can? To the priest. They eat. Right. They make cakes out of it, and all sorts of cupcakes and pancakes, and they eat. This is a nice little reminder straight off the bat that most sacrifices that were most commonly brought by most people did not get completely obliterated in the fire. That most of it, the largest portions of it, were eaten either by the person who brought the sacrifice, or in this particular case, eaten by the priests who offered it.
But isn't it true that the priests have no land? All the tribes are assigned a portion of land, so they can't grow their own food.
Correct.
So in order to help them survive, to sustain them, so they can live, we bring food to the temple.
Correct.
That's where they're part of ours, and we share it with them.
Correct. If you were a Kohen, you did not get, and your ancestors had not gotten a piece of land that you could farm and call your very own, which was the major source of income and food in the ancient world, and therefore you were dependent upon the leftovers. It's not exactly the right word, but the portion that was set aside for you from what was brought for the sacrifices. That was your food. That was what would keep you alive and living, because you weren't going to be out farming. All right. Pleasing odor. right? God wants the sacrifice.
Does that mean if the people stop sinning, the priest would die?
Does that mean if the people stop sinning that the priests would die? No. Hopefully the priests would be very happy about that.
But they're thanks offerings also.
But in fact, there were numerous offerings, not just offerings for atonement. And so the priest would have been able to do quite well on all the others. And in fact, if people were not sinning but were infused with a love of life and a love of Torah and all that God had given them, they might come even more often for good reasons, rather than coming for the guilty ones. Okay, make sense?
Can I ask a very former Goy kind of question?
Now, real gefilte fish doesn't look like that.
Other than gold, frankincense, and myrrh, what is frankincense?
What is frankincense?
That's a good question.
It's a very good. Wait. Does that mean you know what myrrh is?
Yeah.
So frankincense is an aromatic substance. What's that?
Isn't it a bark?
Yeah, it's derived from botanical sources, but it was used because it was especially good smelling. It was especially pungent, and we don't use a lot of it now, at least as far as I know. Maybe it's made its way into cosmetic products in the modern world. They use lots of other weird stuff, but that was what it was highly prized for in the ancient world. Not at all, and that's not a particularly Goyish question. That's a question of just, we don't use this stuff in the modern world. What was it? Okay, onward.
When you present an offering of grain baked in the oven, it shall be of choice flour, unleavened cakes with oil mixed in, or unleavened wafers spread with oil. If your offering is a grain offering on a griddle, it shall be of choice flour and oil mixed in, unleavened. Break it into bits and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your offering is a grain offering in a pan, it shall be made of choice flour and oil. When you present to the Lord a grain offering that is made in any of these ways, it shall be brought to the priest, who shall take it up to the altar. The priest shall remove the double portion from the grain offering and turn it into smoke on the altar as a gift, a pleasing odor to the Lord. And the remainder of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons, and most holy portions of the Lord's gifts.
Okay, how are we doing so far? So you got a variety of different ways that the grain can be prepared, but there's a lot of a common theme through all of them. But just making sure that we see the different options. There you go.
And you mentioned before that it was like leftovers that they were bringing, but really because you're making this as an offer to the Lord and it's supposed to be the choicest, you have to bring the priests from your best stuff.
Correct.
Not the
Not the schmutzy grain at the bottom of the bag.
That's right.
That was left over, and you wouldn't have fed it to your donkey, so you're going to take it to the temple.
And God will know, because when He smells it, He's going to know if it was the good stuff.
We would think that God has other ways of knowing than merely by the aroma, but point is taken.
Who decides whether it's pancakes or waffles or biscuits or stones or whatever else?
Or grits.
Or grits.
Right. So there were different requirements for different sacrifices. So the grain offerings in general is a subcategory of sacrifices. But different occasions would necessitate different ways of preparing it. So this is a generic description of grain offerings in general, but then we would see more detail for what reason you would bring different types of grain offerings in other portions.
Okay, so the priest tells the offerer what to do with the grain?
Correct. You would say, this is the occasion, and the priest would tell you, okay, I need you to get this and this and this, and it's going to be prepared thusly, thusly, thusly.
So who does the actual preparation?
Most of the preparation is done by the Kohen. Good? Yes? No? Okay, good questions. A little more.
No grain offering that you offer to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for no leaven or honey may be turned into smoke as a gift to the Lord.
Right? No yeast, no honey, well, no leaven of any type, but yeast is what we think of most in the modern world. But back then you'd have a leavening agent made up of older fermenting bits of bread, what we now call sourdough. That was the average form of leavening in the ancient world. People didn't have packets of yeast that they could get from a supermarket. You had the old bread that was still rolling with the cultures of the previous 900 loaves that had been made for the rest of the year.
So this is basically matzah.
But no, it's saying it's unleavened. Matzah, in the modern mind, people think of those giant machine-made sheets that are perfectly flat and stiff. It doesn't have to be. You can have unleavened bread that's flexible.
Pita.
Like pita, exactly. But that's a whole other story if we're talking about Pesach. But most likely, most of the matzah that was used in the ancient world for most things was softer than our matzah. That's why when we talk about a korach, when we talk about the sandwich at the Seder that Hillel talks about, that's why it was called a korach, which means a wrap. It wasn't Taco Bell that invented wraps. We've been doing wraps for centuries. But matzah over the years has gotten stiffer and stiffer and stiffer. And so we now end up with the cracker that breaks into 1,000 pieces, like the tablets of the Ten Commandments. But it can be flexible, and if you bake it in non-industrial settings, usually you end up with a more flexible type of bread that is matzah, that is unleavened.
Why?
Why what?
Why no honey? Why no leavened bread?
Good question. Off topic, but good question. What's that?
It's on topic.
It's off topic from where we're going to focus. But there's a number of different suppositions about this. Unfortunately, the Torah itself doesn't say, don't do it because, and launch into a philosophical treatise. And instead, we have to deduce it, which means you get multiple opinions. But the general opinions focus either on practice of other nations that we were trying to avoid, meaning not imitating other nations' sacrificial rites. And the other is the idea that these were, especially the leavening agents, were signs of arrogance, of puffing oneself up, etc. And that when you approach the altar, you are supposed to be at your meekest. You're standing in the most humble of positions, because you're standing in front of God in the most clearest sense in your life. We're always in the presence of God, but we don't always think about it the same way we think about it when we stand in front of the altar. But we'll have to leave it for today's discussion. But you're right, it is a little frustrating sometimes when the Torah doesn't go into the details we want. That's why we study, and if it isn't the topic of study for me and us today, that's where personal research and investigation comes in. And I highly recommend that you can go home and crack open some commentaries that you might already have, or check on the internet. It's not all bad stuff out there, and see what's been said. And you can report back with a 5-page essay next week. No. Jeff. It's something you can discuss over lunch. Okay. Little more.
You may bring them to the Lord as an offering of choice products, but they shall not be offered up on the altar for a pleasing odor.
That is to say, the leavening and the honey can come for some things, but they're not offered specifically on the altar. They can be a donation, they can't be an offering.
You shall season your every offering of grain with salt. You shall not omit from your grain offering the salt of your covenant with God. With all your offerings you must offer salt.
Get the point?
Salt.
All right. Where is this reflected in passing? Where is this reflected in modern practice?
Worth the salt.
Kosher with salt.
No, caution with the salt is actually to help remove the blood.
Right.
The challah on salt when we do Shabbos meal times. It is specifically comes from this idea. There's also a secondary idea that if a person could survive, especially with the more vegetative versions of bread that was common in the ancient world, that with just bread and salt, a person could survive quite a long time. It would be enough to make a meal. Whereas bread alone, you're missing that essential ingredient. So there's also a notion of giving thanks for even the most basic of food, which would be bread and salt.
One question. The salt of your covenant, what is that regarding?
We'll get to that phrase. Because it is a rather unusual phrase. What does it mean to have, if you look in the verse 13 there, what does it mean to have of melach brit, of covenantal salt? Is this a new brand name? And we're going to come back to that. All right, one more paragraph, and then we're done with the Torah reading for the moment.
If you bring a grain offering of first fruits to the Lord, you shall bring new ears parched with fire, grits of the first of the fresh grain, as your grain offering of first fruits. You shall add oil to it, and lay frankincense on it. It is a grain offering. And the priest shall turn a token portion of it into smoke, some of the grits and oil, with all of the frankincense as a gift to the Lord.
Okay. Sound good? Not so much? No?
Grits and all.
Grits and all. Stepping aside from the recipe, what about the process of offerings? Remember, we've talked for the last couple of weeks a little bit about the building of the Mishkan and a potential reestablishment of a new temple. Anybody interested in offering some grain again? Of taking grain from, imagine you were a farmer, and imagine you didn't mind that. Could you see yourself being spiritually uplifted and finding satisfaction of bringing something that you had grown to the altar?
Not so much, it would be better than killing an animal for it.
So grain would be better than an animal, but you'd rather not do either.
Correct.
Well, why is it better than an animal?
I don't know that for anything, either for a thanks or for a sin, I want to see something else die.
Isn't that part of it though?
That's what I don't
The
want.
next time you do something wrong, you say,
Oh,
oh
man.
my God, what's the implications of...
Well, but if we got used to that, then we might not see it the same way if we were accustomed to seeing them slaughtered. I mean, I know we eat kosher meat, so they're being slaughtered anyway. Just, if I don't see it, it's somehow easier than if I have to watch it die.
I think it makes it harder to sin if you know
Maybe.
what happens.
Because people don't speed if they know they can get a ticket.
Well, people slow down when you're a speed counter.
Well, that, yes.
True.
But otherwise-
And if they felt there was a speed camera everywhere, they'd complain about privacy issues.
That's right. That's right.
And they would probably still speed, thinking, well, they're not going to ticket all of us.
Not me.
But there is a question of whether or not the sacrifices were meant as a penalty or not. And certainly by the behavior of the people, as we're going to discuss, the fact that they brought sacrifices did not seem to have a massive impact on the behaviors that we would perhaps like it to have had an impact on. It didn't necessarily seem to keep them from transgressing. I mean, from idolatry at a base, but in many other ways as well.
When this practice was in full swing throughout the country,
Right.
how often would a typical family make a sacrifice, whether grain or animal or...
Well, 3 times a year, you would go for the pilgrimage festivals, the Chagim, for Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot.
But how about in a typical week with your typical transgressions and things and thanks?
No, you would not be weekly journeying to Jerusalem for these things. Remember, most of the transgressions you were supposed to be avoiding, as you said. So it wasn't likely that you would be transgressing things commonly enough that you would need to be bringing sacrifices on a regular basis. It wasn't like you would just have an account at the temple and say, I did another one, put it on my account. It would be a special circumstance to go. And like I said, for the average person, it might be they only went to the temple 3 times a year. But someone may go another couple of times, maybe for the birth of a child, maybe for a particularly monumental event in the family life. But it wouldn't be like every morning they'd wake up and say, okay, yesterday I committed the following 5 sins, and now I've got to go to Jerusalem today, or else you'd never leave the city limits. Most people would probably have sinned before they left the temple precinct. So, okay, so the future awaits us. Michael, I'm not going to beg for another volunteer, so I'm going to make you keep going.
Then the grain offering of Judah and Yerushalayim will be pleasing to God as in the days of old and as in ancient years.
Prophet Malachi gives a prophecy. which seems to indicate that in the future, when everything is right and good with the world, we'll be doing grain offerings again. So sorry, Harriet.
Yeah, I'm sorry too, but maybe I'll stop praying for the Messiah.
Maybe you'll stop praying for the Messiah just because you don't want to give
I
grain.
don't want to get into this again.
I might want to point out that seems a little short-sighted.
Okay.
But I don't see a lot of smiles around the room for the notion that some of the prophets have indicated that there would be a restoration of the sacrificial service. We've talked a little bit tangentially, as we talked about the Mishkan in the past, about whether there would or would not be, and I figured now might be a good time to go into some more sources on this topic. There are at least some voices which can be read that indicate that there would be a restoration. Make sense? Now, just to go ahead and make sure that people don't get squirmy and run out of here too soon, how could we read this verse without pledging a allegiance to a literal restoration of the offerings again?
The word that's translated grain offering is in the Hebrew mincha, isn't it?
Correct.
And we use that word now to refer to one of the regular prayer services during the day.
So a very simple way is what we've already done, which is we've named one of the prayer services mincha, and it matches the name of the grain offering, and simply say, well, then the mincha that we already do, that of prayer, will be pleasing to God. Very simple, but notice that Malachi here is implying, and the more you read Tanakh, the more you'll be familiar with this, is implying that the mincha offerings in his day had not necessarily ceased. What was wrong with them? They didn't please God. That it wasn't, for some of the prophets, it wasn't a question of when do we get to do sacrifices again. It was, when will our sacrifices actually be pleasing again? Because we're still doing them, or at least lots of people are still doing them, but they ain't exactly doing anything. They don't seem to be pleasing to God. And so this notion here may be a question of not literally when will we be doing the grain offerings again, but when will the ways that we serve God be pleasing to God once more? Because the way we're doing it at the moment seems to be insufficient or misguided, or, well, we'll talk about some of the other options.
When the prophets all this time, wasn't there a lot of idolatry going on? Or people would bring sacrifices to the temple and then go out and do something they shouldn't do?
Which we're going to cover, exactly. All right, so keep going. We're going to jump from Malachi to Rav Kook, the first and best chief rabbi that Israel's ever had, and it's been downhill since. So, no, it's very, very serious, and if
Warren wasn't there.
yeah, ish, but he was no Rav Kook. The point being that if Rav Kook had not been who Rav Kook was, we probably would not have a chief rabbi in Israel today. If he hadn't set such an amazing precedent, people would have said, what do we need this chief rabbi for? I mean, the British made us have a chief rabbi. We never had chief rabbis until the Goyim told us to have a chief rabbi. And now that we became an independent state, well, we're going to have a chief rabbi? And they said, well, who's the chief rabbi? Well, with that guy, I can see that guy being the rabbi for Israel. Okay, I can buy it. Okay, we'll keep it. If they had just said, him? He's going to be the rabbi? We don't want him. I want another. They would have all been done, and we would have had a much more balanced system in Israel. But we were blessed and cursed with Rav Kook.
With regard to sacrifices, it is more correct to believe that all aspects will be restored to their place.
All right. Everything's coming back, says Rav Kook. Not just grain sacrifices, all of it. The blood, guts, and glory.
We should not be overly troubled by the views of European culture. In the future, God's word to his people will elevate all the foundations of culture to a level above that attainable by human reason.
All right, so Rav Kook, what's his argument about why you shouldn't be squirming in your chairs when we talk about reinstituting the blood, guts, and glory?
We don't have enough, we're not smart enough to figure it out.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, you're judging the rightness of animal sacrifice on some European notion of propriety. It's okay to again, from Rav Kook's experience, it's okay to gas people in the trenches with mustard gas, but animal sacrifice, that's disgusting. he's saying this is your benchmark for whether or not it would be good to have animal sacrifices again, is a culture that seems to have such twisted values on many, many issues, not across the board. Make sure we're understanding here. It's not saying that all of Western culture is bad, but just because Western culture in its modern form can't understand animal sacrifices, there's no reason to say animal sacrifices are bad or that I don't think animal sacrifices should come again. The argument he's making is that, of course, when Mashiach comes, that we will finally, in a modern sense, understand sacrifices and their place and their purpose, and then we will realize that this is truly a beautiful and wonderful thing. And everyone in the world will come to agree that this is not a pagan, ancient, outdated mode of worship, but is in true a wonderful thing.
The other advantage I'm wondering about with animal sacrifices, the way our culture today has elevated animals almost to the class of human being. And there was an amazing survey done among college kids that said, if there was a burning building and your dog was there versus a person you never met, would you, and you could only save one, would you save the dog or would you save the stranger? And the majority of people said, I would save the dog.
Correct.
And
that survey has been repeated in numerous different settings and numerous different ways of asking it, and the results have all been very consistent.
And there's something about animal sacrifice that puts
animals in their place.
In their proper place. That, although I'm troubled by it, there's a benefit to it as well. To say these are not at the same level as human beings.
The difference between a human and an animal is one of us can end up on the altar. And you should know that, Bessie. Right?
Right.
My pet lamb Flossie, understand, as much as I love you, you can end up on the altar and I can't.
And actually, that was one of the innovations of Judaism. Was before that there were human sacrifices. People did end up on the altar.
In some cultures, absolutely, yes.
Don't kill your son. It's not going to happen anymore. So that was one of our good things just now.
But the question would be, were we, as we have talked about actually when we discussed Vayikra last year, and we were looking more at the position of Rambam, was that a capitulation to humans? That is to say, did God say, or was God thinking, I don't want any sacrifices, but you guys are so used to sacrifices that you need something. So fine, but if you're going to do it like this, which is essentially Rambam's position, that it was a way of God trying to train us. But God wasn't really keen on the whole notion of sacrifice in the first place. But he had to do something because we had to walk before we could run, as the expression goes. And so limiting humans was a big step. Limiting the type of animals was a big step. Making it be all the other rules was a big step. Sharing most of the food was a big step. But the ideal implied by that theory is that it would be better if there weren't any sacrifices at all. And that perhaps now we're living in the ideal.
And I may say that I agree with you completely, and I think...
You agree with Rambam.
Rambam, yes, with Rambam. And I believe that God allowed the temple to be destroyed because he had felt we were at the point where we did not need to do these anymore. It was a part of our growth. Not that we should, not that we should, oh no, the temple has to come back. I think it was part of the plan that eventually we would not need to be doing that to animals. We would understand that you still save the person in the burning building without having to kill animals in front of us to atone or give thanks. The destruction of the temple is part of the plan, not a horrible thing that happened despite God's wishes and that he wants it back.
Which, if you'll read the next text,
all sacrifices will be annulled in the future.
Vayikra Rabbah, one of the earlier midrashic texts, says, what's that say? What's that?
No sacrifices in the future.
No sacrifices in the future. What does that mean about now?
When was Vayikra Rabbah?
When was Vayikra Rabbah? Well, Vayikra Rabbah was was printed longer ago than yesterday. I think its final editing was somewhere around 1,500 years ago, a little bit more probably. But have they been annulled yet?
At his time?
Well, in Vayikra Rabba's time, if they weren't annulled in his time, I guess you could argue they've been annulled since he lived, but I didn't get that memo. I don't know if you did. So that we could read Vayikra Rabbah as saying, no sacrifices ever again. But the same authors who wrote the Midrash in Vayikra Rabbah are the ones who also helped to codify our Siddur, which, as we have seen and discussed, still mentions the restoration of the sacrificial services. So there seems to be a notion here in the Midrash that yes, at some point in the indeterminate future, there will be a formal declaration that sacrifices are done. But even though we're currently not doing them, that doesn't mean that they've been stricken from the books.
They're in hiatus because there's no place to do it.
They are in hiatus rather than having been annulled. Whereas what Harriet was saying, and the way many people have read Rambam, would be to imply that they were annulled already, and it's not merely a temporary hiatus. I should point out for people who like to argue that that's what Rambam was saying, Rambam wrote a great many chapters about exactly how to do sacrifices. So for someone who was quoted as saying that sacrifices were an early evolutionary step in the Jewish people and that it's something we shouldn't necessarily hope to go back to, he took a lot of time to actually figure out how we would do it if there was an altar to do it on. So it's not quite as cut and dry.
So he voted for sacrifices before he voted against them.
Which, Michael, we'll go back to your reading. If you read the next psalm, will show us that this ambivalence has existed before even Rambam.
O Lord, open my lips and my mouth shall declare your praise. For you do not delight in sacrifice, else I would give it. You take no pleasure in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise.
Oh, so see, no sacrifices. The psalmist doesn't want sacrifices. Well, keep reading.
Do good in your favor to Zion, build the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in the sacrifices of righteousness, in burnt offering and whole offering. Then they will offer bullocks up on your altar.
Or maybe the psalmist does. So first of all, he starts off by saying, what God doesn't delight in sacrifices, but instead delights in the humble and meek and the righteous. But then it says, but rebuild Zion, rebuild Jerusalem, and we'll be offering sacrifices again. So first he voted against it, then he voted for it. How do we make sense of this? I mean, we're not talking about two different opinions from our tradition. We're talking about one psalm even, not even two psalms. We're talking one psalm as part of the Tanakh, as part of what we consider to be revealed wisdom from God. And we have on the same page, mere verses apart, such ambivalence. Isn't it? Is it? Okay. Howie, you mentioned animals and people, so I'm going to give you the honor of reading the next text from the Arizal, from Kabbalah.
All aspects of the universe will be elevated.
This is in the time of the Mashiach.
Even the animals in the future era will be different. They will advance to the level of people nowadays.
Okay, I thought you'd appreciate that. Hey! All right, so whenever you're dealing with the Ari, face value is really the last place you want to look. So what's he trying to say here? Well, first of all, let's take on the practical side. If animals are advanced in the days of the Mashiach to a spiritual status similar to the spiritual status of these current animals, meaning human animals, that is to say, if they are elevated to be of spiritual capability, the same way that we as animals have a spiritual capability, which as well will be elevated, you might imply that there's no way you can sacrifice them. That to sacrifice an animal that has the spiritual capability of a current generation human will be the equivalent of a human sacrifice. You'd be sacrificing a spirit of equal value, value's not the right, of equal capacity. And that would seem to be wrong. But what he's actually trying to talk about, in addition to that, as it has been used, to argue that he's against full restoration of animal sacrifices in the days of Mashiach, is you can also see that he's trying to say that there is going to be a progression of our spirit to a higher and deeper connection to God. That the barriers that exist between us and God at the moment will become lessened in the future. And indeed, all of reality will draw closer to God in the future, even down through the animal kingdom.
But is that just because of the progress of time, or is that because of action?
Yes. Yes. A maturation of reality, if you will, but it's also meant to be a fulfillment of action guided by Mashiach, which elevates the entire world in the process. For those of you that are a little bit more familiar with Kabbalah, you'll know that one of the big issues, especially in the Ari's worldview, is this notion of reality as containing the seeds of God, of pieces of God within the klipot, of the shells, and of stripping those away and allowing the true essence to return to God more smoothly, more purely. As that process advances to perfection, then by extension, all of reality becomes elevated closer and closer to God. That's all the Kabbalah we have for today. We'll move on.
I read a parable somewhere that was talking about a particular lamb that was brought to the sacrifice, and some of them said, well, that's not, this is an imperfection.
Right? It's blemished.
And so they went to a higher authority.
Mm-hmm.
He says, yes. And some of the ones who were against it came back later and said, why did you allow that lamb to be sacrificed?
Right.
He says, I don't want to meet that lamb in the world to come and him blame me for not letting him be a sacrifice.
Interesting. That's very interesting. It's also, by the way, a very good parable for how we meet people who come towards Judaism, whether they be a Baal Tshuva, someone returning to Judaism, or whether it be someone who is a prospective convert. That who are we to say no for their attempts to return? Who are we to put barriers in their way that keep them away? Because would you want to meet them in Olam Haba and try to explain to them why you kept them from making that step? Okay. Part of the difficulty, I think, with all of this, which Rav Kook began, and we're going to go back to Rav Kook, which will fill out for us, is that we have a notion of sacrifice as being a primitive act. We have the notion of sacrifice as being spiritually naive. Partly, I think we believe that because it was a common practice across all cultures, and we assume that all cultures that have outgrown it have somehow matured to a point where they no longer need it. And if you keep doing it, despite everyone else growing up, then it's the equivalent of a 30-year-old who still plays with Legos. You know? And people look at the 30-year-old that plays with Legos and says, well, you outgrew Legos. I don't know what's wrong with him. He must be immature.
But why would such a significant percentage of Tanakh be dedicated to this topic if it's Lego?
Exactly. And I'd like to even argue that my parable of the Lego builder was very deliberately chosen. That I can see lots of reasons why a 30-year-old would still use Legos. We might not call play with Legos if we're trying to be polite, but Legos are amazing. You can make anything. I don't know whether you've seen some of the creations that brilliant 30, 40, 50, 60-year-olds have done with Legos. They are an incredible medium for expression, for art, and for creativity that I don't understand why it would stop at a certain age. I personally was never a big Lego guy, but I see nothing wrong with an adult who still wants to use Legos. Is the mature thing meant to be sit and watch TV? But to sit and spend the same amount of time creating some beautiful creation out of colored bricks, that's a waste of time. But the TV is good. Is it going to a sports game? That's a mature use of time. But making wonderful art with your hands, that's a waste. Or the art has to be made only from certain mediums, and then it's official, and if it's from a different medium, it's not. And the problem is that we smear at things that we don't understand. which is what Rav Kook began with, and which is what he's going to lead us through in a second part.
It is inappropriate to think that sacrifices only reflect the primitive idea of worship of flesh. This service possesses a holy inner nature that cannot be revealed in its beauty without the illumination of God's light to his people, the return of prophecy, and a renewal of holiness in Israel. And this will be recognized by all peoples. But I agree with your honor that we should not approach the practical aspects of sacrifices without the advent of revealed divine inspiration in Israel.
All right, so Rav Kook was of the opinion for that second, the end of the paragraph. He was of the opinion that we should not actively be seeking the restoration of the sacrificial service. We shouldn't be going through the practical steps, a la what the Temple Institute is currently doing, until prophecy has been restored to Israel, i.e. until the days of Mashiach. But just because he doesn't believe that we have the wherewithal to actually begin the sacrificial service again, or that we should even begin deliberating it, doesn't mean that we're withholding our efforts because we believe it's bad, or because we believe it's primitive. And as Howie said, so much of the Tanakh has sacrifices as a main feature, either of the rules and the guidance, or as a feature of what's going on in the community around them, that we can't just simply discount it as being stupid or as being primitive or naive. We can argue about whether or not it was a necessary step or not a necessary step, which you can look up last year's class if you want to go into that discussion in more detail. But I want to try and understand what are the spiritually significant and resonant ideas within sacrifice that make it worthwhile to even be part of our history, regardless of whether it's part of our future. What did sacrifice do spiritually for us? Not just about feeding the Kohanim. Nada. Shum davar.
To express our joy or expiate our guilt or other emotional attachments or emotional catharsis as we brought the sacrifice to the temple.
So there was a notion of, I believe the word you used was expression.
Expression.
Right, expression of various spiritual and emotional states.
Just the word. I would suggest from the word that we wanted to get closer to God, and the hope was that these sacrifices would bring us closer to God.
So by the word you're meaning the word korban?
Yes.
Right, so the word korban, for those of you that aren't Hebrew mavens, comes from the same root of nikarev, to draw close to something. There's some grammatical arguments about exactly how close they are and all their meanings, but the basic notion certainly was reinforced in the service and reinforced in our understanding of it, that one of the primary forms was not only expression, but was connection. That the sacrifices were there to provide a connection between us and God. And there was a connection that would allow us to translate the physical into spiritual. Notice what it is that is pleasing to God. What's that?
The odor.
The odor, right? The reach, the least tangible of the material world. What's the least thing that we can sense that has some tangibility nonetheless? Is smell. Right? It's this nothingness that is completely ephemeral, or at least 99% ephemeral, and yet just a little bit of it, pow, can hit your senses, can make that connection. That wasn't because they thought God had giant nostrils and was sucking up the smell of the sacrifices. It was because the person who was offering it would be able to see the physical translated into something that they couldn't touch, but that they could feel, and that would express and connect at the same time.
There, allow me a psychological explanation.
Please.
Is that the sense of smell is most primitive. It evokes the most emotional response and memory. It brings up memories that go back to even predating. And people are smelling it too.
Yes.
I mean, what does going to a barbecue do for you? It makes me happy, it makes me feel good, the mouth starts to water. I mean, a lot of things happen to people just in the presence of these sacrifices.
Exactly. So,
But it's more than that, isn't it? As part of the service, the person had to actually put their hands on the animal
Mhm.
before it was slaughtered. I mean, there's touch. It's all the same.
They're all there, exactly.
I mean, you're attached to that animal, and then.
So what you get, and again, as always, pardon my art. That's a cow. Yes.
That's a cow.
Remember how I said some people express themselves with Legos or other art? Yeah. I'll stick with words for now.
Generic behavior.
And we've got the guy who's there, and he's got his hand on the animal. That's a hand, not. You ever seen what was that thing with the scissor hands? Edward Scissorhands? Yeah. And that connection becomes, as you say, a very powerful moment for him. And as this gets translated into fire, as this gets thrown, either the blood or the fat onto the altar, and that smell creates, that there is a powerful, powerful sensation for the person who has brought the sacrifice. But it does something else if they are focused correctly, which is it creates a vertical sense of transcendence. It creates a vertical sense of being connected to God. We use vertical because it's easiest for us to imagine of God as up, but of course, God doesn't live in one dimension or direction. But that process was not stupid. It did and does have a human resonance. When you take the chametz that you are burning before Pesach, do none of you, when you throw it into the fire, feel anything other than just, I'm cleaning? If you've cleaned your yard of leaves and you have permits and you're allowed to do it where you live, and you burn the leaves, when you stand and watch the burning, do you feel nothing about what's happening? I mean, that's almost a trivial sense of burning. There is a deep feeling of awe when we watch something that is physical be transferred into smoke, into fire.
A lot of people still have fireplaces and go camping. It's all about the experiences in the fire.
We were adamant that even though we were moving to Florida, we would buy a house with a fireplace. We've never had to use it to warm the house, but we've used it to warm our hearts quite often.
Something fairly primitive, I mean, in the bad sense, but it's fundamental.
Fundamental, exactly. There is an emotional connection to the fire, to the smoke, to the smells, and when this is connected to God, it works. It is powerful, but does it work completely? That's what we're going to come to. So keep reading, because we've only got a few minutes left, and we got more text to cover.
And Neo-Babylonian letters speaks of all who have tasted the salt of the, I don't know that.
Don't worry, it's Neo-Babylonian, so we don't care if we get it right.
Yakin tribe, referring to the tribe's covenanted allies. Loyalty to the Persian monarch is claimed by having tasted the salt of the palace in Ezra 4:14. An Arabic milkat, a derivative of malakah, to salt, means
Treaty. All right. So you asked earlier on, Michael, what is this melach brit? What is this salt of a covenant? And Milgram is bringing in his commentary other parallel texts, other sources from other Near Eastern communities, from Babylonian, from Persian, and even from the Arabic, that salt has a covenantal feature in most of these ancient cultures. That salt was considered to be a symbol of the covenant between you and someone else. And so by salting the sacrifice, whether it be animal or otherwise, as part of this transition, it makes perfect sense to the idiom of the ancient world. Because it's what you would have done if you were making a deal with the guy next door, if you were making a treaty with the other country. You would have salted what you were sharing at that time as well.
Salt is very important.
Right.
Not only did it taste good, but it was the only preservative they had.
Yeah, pre-refrigeration, you wanted salt.
And if you lived in that kind of climate, you needed salt because
Mhm.
you were constantly perspiring, and you would just keel over without constantly taking salt.
Correct. And of course, a great reminder that Roman soldiers were paid in salt. When we use the phrase worth his salt, that's what we're referring to. And the English word salary is derived from the same root. So, yeah, salt matters, And the salting of this should remind us even more that what we're doing with the sacrifice is not appeasing an angry God. It's not feeding a God. It is a statement of covenantal relationship. It is saying, God and I are joining together at this moment through this act. Something, by the way, that you can also keep in mind when you do the salt with the challah on Shabbos. So that should also be in your mind, that salt is you and God together joining in a covenant on that moment. Just a little something to keep in the corner of the brain while you're also figuring out which piece to eat. Okay, let's keep going a little bit more on this notion of sacrifices and what it can do for our relationship with God.
When the Lord enlarges your territory as he promised you, and you say, I shall eat some meat, for you have the urge to eat meat, you may eat meat whenever you wish. If the place where the Lord has chosen to establish his name is too far from you, you may slaughter any of the cattle or sheep that the Lord gives you, as I have instructed you, and you may eat your heart's content in your settlements. Eat it, however, as the gazelle and the deer are eaten. The unclean may eat it together with the clean. But make sure that you do not partake of the blood, for the blood is the life, and you must not consume the life with the flesh. You must not partake of it. You must pour it out on the ground like wood. You must not partake of it, in order that it may go well with you and your descendants to come, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of the Lord.
All right. So Harriet, as you mentioned earlier, you like the idea of grain better than animals for sacrifice, but you also pointed out that you're not a vegetarian.
Yes.
And I think that's an important point for us to remember whenever we think of a reconstitution of the sacrificial service. Because most of us have this instinctual uncomfortableness with the idea of an animal being sacrificed on an altar. And yet, most of us have much less discomfort with the idea of an animal being killed so that I can have lunch. Why in the world do we have it like that? This, God's permission to eat animals generically, non-sacrificially, is a compromise to us. The primary form of taking a life should be for a higher purpose of creating a bridge between ourselves and God. God is being extremely generous to us by saying we can take life just to stuff our bellies. But that doesn't mean that this is insignificant spiritually. And if we can find any spirituality through the laws of kashrut and the acts of blessing our food before we eat over this carcass that's on our plate, then all the more so we should understand that there can be spiritual significance in the practice of sacrifice. And again, we don't have to be hoping that it's going to be reinstituted tomorrow, because we may not be ready for that. And certainly Rav Kook is aware that we probably will not understand how it would be done or should be done until Mashiach comes, and I heartily agree with him on that point. But that doesn't mean that when we come to the whole book of Vayikra and we see all these sacrifices that we should just start flipping the pages until, Nadav and Avihu die, and then we get some other good stuff in the storyline, and then just skip all the sacrifice. This stuff is meant for spiritual edification. It's not filler, just to make the book longer. Maybe a little bit harder to access, absolutely, but it's not filler. All right. Michael, you ready for a few more paragraphs?
Sure.
Sure.
This is like an uncouth prince who was given to devouring unslaughtered meat. The king said, let him always be at my table, and he will be reformed on his own. So too, since the Israelites were keenly devoted to idolatry in Egypt, the Holy One said, let them offer their sacrifices before me at all times.
All right, so we get two little elements in here that are both important. One is the historical. They were already doing sacrifice type stuff down in Egypt, because that's what the Egyptians were like. So rather than trying to get them to stop, which may have been hard, just giving them orders, if you're going to eat, you do it at my table, and you do it according to my rules. And so the prince that would normally just be he's slobbering over a chunk of meat, when he's at the king's table, behaves more appropriately because he's at the king's table. And in the process, he will become more refined, more cultured, if you will, in the act of eating in the presence of the king. And so the sacrificial service, again, was not just because God wanted it, but because God knew that our performance of this mitzvah in the ways that God had given it to us would train us, would elevate us, would make us better people. And that's the side effect, or the benefit of what this is supposed to do, and where I want to translate, as we're running out of time, into the modern world. Because we don't have sacrifices right now. But our Jewish expression to God, our Jewish connection to God, too often gets bifurcated between the vertical and the horizontal among people. We talk all the time about Judaism as a religion of social action, of social justice, right? Feed the naked, or feed the hungry, clothe the naked. Although the naked probably need food too. Look after the widow and the orphan and the stranger. All of the commandments that we have regarding tzedakah and of building a fair and just society, that dominates many people's conception of Jewish life and Jewish practice. Other people, it's all about them and God and that relationship, that vertical connection to the transcendent, of bringing God more into their lives and bringing themselves more towards God. The sacrifices were meant to do this, to make it all the same. A sacrificial relationship that was just you and God alone was incomplete. Because drawing closer to God was supposed to make your connection to the rest of the world better. And vice versa. Drawing closer to other people and helping other people and having the sense of justice and fairness and rightness that God has given to us in the instructions through Torah is not supposed to just draw us closer in a bear hug with all of humanity in the world, but it's also supposed to elevate us closer to God as well. If you draw closer to God and further from people, you're doing it wrong. And if you draw closer to people and further from God, you're doing it wrong. And the sacrifices were meant to show us that. The sacrifices were not done alone. It was done communally, it was done publicly, and it was always shared with others who were there. Time and time again, when we are told to bring sacrifices for happy occasions or for Chagim, we are told that we must share it with those who have nothing. That you don't just make the sacrifice and then eat. You make the sacrifice and you share it with others and eat. The sacrifices were intrinsically being done by, and in many cases given to, people who had nothing, the Kohanim. That they could not be a selfish act. Even if you were repenting for terrible, terrible things, they could not be a private act. A sacrifice was never something you just went in your backyard and did. It was always brought into this communal setting.
In Talmud it says that if we eat with others and don't discuss Torah, it's the same as offering to idols. Correct. To eat with others and not share words of Torah is the equivalent of idolatry, because you are just slaughtering for nothing. You did not enrich this moment with a sense of godliness, and that's a problem. This model, even without sacrifices, is still very, very relevant. Someone who comes to shul every day, who davens every day, who studies Torah every day, and then goes and cheats people out of millions of dollars and defrauds them, isn't doing it right. And vice versa, someone who slaves away in the soup kitchen, who is constantly donating to charity, who is working to give malaria shots in Africa, but gives no sense or no thought to the structure of the world and of God beyond that. Well, they're doing much better than the guy who stole $1 million from people, because at least their works are durable and good, but they're also not doing it right. They're not fulfilling themselves or their potential for this vertical connection, this broader structure. It has to all work together, or it doesn't work at all. Yes.
Is not the purpose of sacrifice to make a change here?
Absolutely.
Totally here?
Right, but it makes a change here so that it makes a change here in what we do.
If the change is here, it's going to be here as well.
If it's a real change, absolutely. And that's why I'm just going to read the last two paragraphs myself so that we can sort of zip it up and finish it off.
So the first is from Abarbanel, the great medieval commentator, as he sets out to write his commentary on Vayikra. He has a very nice long introductory passage. This is a short excerpt. The Torah needed to write this third book, meaning why did Leviticus come where Leviticus comes, in order to explain it in the service of the Mikdash and how the Kohanim serve their God and gain atonement for the sins of Israelites. Well, that sounds very normal, right? We had all of creation, we had Israel being created as a separate family, we have the experience in Egypt, the giving of the Torah, and now we've got the Mishkan built. Well, now that we've done that, it's only logical that we should talk about how the Mishkan is used. We mentioned that at the very beginning of today. And this is where he points out something very good, and that they endeavor always to delve into and to know the Torah of God, its statutes, commandments, and laws in order to keep the nation straight, to teach them the path in which to go and the actions to take. Do you ever wonder why Parashat Kiddushim is in the middle of Vayikra? In the middle of Leviticus? Love your neighbor as yourself? Why is that in all of the sacrificial stuff? Shouldn't that be in Deuteronomy? Or shouldn't that be like, in Mishpatim, right after the giving of the Ten Commandments? Put it with the other inspiring narrative stuff. Why put it among the blood, guts, and glory? Why? Because that is the purpose of the blood, guts, and glory. Is to understand that while you sacrifice, you're also loving your neighbor as yourself, and while you love your neighbor as yourself, you're also building a relationship to God. That these are not opposite activities, but that they are one giant bundle that is all meant to accomplish the same thing simultaneously by reinforcing it. And just to finish off with, the beautiful quote from Jeremiah 7, one of my favorites: "Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name?" Right? That it's not like we can come into an active Jewish setting, having ruined everything on either side of us, and expect that this connection is going to be fine. And vice versa. In the long term, you take this out, and you think this is going to exist very long? I mean, it's nice to imagine that a person could be good and right without a connection to God. And certainly, moral inertia helps an awful lot. That, we have been pushing the world towards greater and greater morality for so many thousands of years, that if someone steps aside from that push, they will continue to drift in a moral and ethical way for some time. But if they don't reconnect themselves to that source of the impetus, that source of nourishment for morality and ethics, they will peter out, and society along with them. I have nothing against atheists. Some of my best friends are atheists. But long term, without a connection to something greater than themselves, in a sense of a rightness and a wrongness, and just a universe that goes beyond what they can conceive today, eventually mistakes will be made, as they say. It doesn't mean that religion has always been perfect. It doesn't mean religious people have always been perfect. But the power that God has given to change the world comes from our connection to God, as well as our desire to change the world. And we need to remember both sides at all times. And with that, thank you very much.
Very nice.